Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As the first panel highlighted, I think everyone in this room would agree, there's a consensus view that we need to do something about infrastructure investment in this country. But exactly how to go about financing that continues to be a policy and political challenge. So as the first panel alluded to, the Hamilton Project this week has put out a new discussion paper. We were privileged to have this paper written by Alan Krueger, Aaron Klein, and Roger Altman. And in this paper, the authors make a series of concrete proposals that would move us toward a more stable and long-term system of infrastructure financing in this country. In a moment, I'm going to invite Alan up to the podium to describe for us briefly their proposals. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce the panel very briefly. I'll start with our authors. Alan Krueger is professor of economics at Princeton University. He was formerly chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the early years of the Obama administration, and he served tours of duty in both the departments, the U.S. Departments of Treasury and Labor. And writing with him was Aaron Klein, currently director of the Financial Regulatory Initiatives at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Aaron's also worked at the Treasury Department, and prior to that, served for a number of years on the staff of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. We're honored to have with us this afternoon Congressman John Delaney, who represents the 6th District of Maryland. And of course, Congressman Delaney has introduced an infrastructure bill in Congress, which has received bipartisan support. So we will look forward to hearing more about that in the roundtable portion of the panel. And I'll note that prior to assuming public office in 2012, Congressman Delaney served for more than 2 decades in the financial sector. We're also delighted to have with us as a discussant on these proposals, Tyler Duvall, who's a principal at McKinesey and Company, where his client work includes advising large infrastructure owners and operators on improving decision-making as well as strategic investments. And before joining McKinsey, Tyler was Assistant Secretary and Undersecretary for Transportation Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. So we'll start with an overview of the paper and the proposals from Professor Krueger, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion.
Thank you, Melissa. I should also begin by thanking Roger for pulling us together to work on this. This was really his idea, and he recruited Aaron and me. Just to set the scene, as you know, we've been grossly underinvesting in public infrastructure in the U.S. The top line shows state and local government spending on infrastructure, which is lower today in real dollars than it was 10 years ago. The green line at the bottom shows federal spending. You can see the effect of the Recovery Act. Little blip right there. So I very much agree with Congresswoman DeLauro that the biggest problem was that we spent too little. And even if the money went out too slowly, we still have a tremendous need for additional infrastructure spending. So I never quite understood that as a critique of that aspect of the Recovery Act. This next chart shows you the current balance in the Highway Trust Fund. The darker green line, or maybe turquoise, does not include transfers from the general fund. And the bottom line shows the balance or annual net income, and you can see the dire situation that we see ourselves in. And I'll say more about the gas tax, which is used to fund the Highway Trust Fund. The gas tax, as Governor Rendell polled people, is still 18.4 cents a gallon, what it was in 1993. If it were adjusted for overall price inflation, it would be about 30 cents a gallon today. Relative to the price of gasoline, it's less than half, even with the low price of gasoline today compared to 1993. So that's just by way of background. The philosophy of our paper is that smart investment in infrastructure will pay high returns to society. I think there are a lot of economic arguments that make this case. Even the IMF recently endorsed this. Interest rates are currently very low. Construction worker unemployment remains high. Over the last year, the unemployment rate for construction workers was 50% above the overall unemployment rate in the U.S. Our need to repair our infrastructure and improve our infrastructure is high. It will help raise competitiveness in the future. To an economist, the most sensible, natural way to fund infrastructure is through user fees or beneficiary fees. That's the most natural way because it's more efficient in that people bear the cost of the infrastructure that they're consuming. And it's also fair because people are paying for what they're consuming and you're not asking others to pay for it. One of the philosophies that Roger continually reminded us of is that more is better than less infrastructure investment. So what we try to do in this paper is to propose fiscally responsible ways to improve the quantity and quality of infrastructure investment, but we don't want to let the best be the enemy of the good, so I'll have some more to say about that later on. And we start with short-term proposals to move the ball forward in the near term, which we think is kind of the edge of what could be done in the current Congress, and then longer-term proposals to lead to even greater investment and smarter investment. So a core component of our proposal is to greatly expand the TIFIA program. Congress has done this before. It seems to be very successful. We propose increasing funding from $1 billion to $10 billion annually. The way that TIFIA works, this could support infrastructure projects up to $400 billion, the way we propose expanding TIFIA. We would expand it to non-surface transportation projects such as aviation and ports. We would also propose, and this could be done administratively, improving the credit scoring of the TIFIA program. TIFIA has lost hardly any money, I think no money, over the life of the program. So we propose cutting the current subsidy rate when it's scored from 10% to 5%, which would leverage the program from 10 to 1 up to 20 to 1. And then with the match of non-federal funding, 1-to-1 match, that doubles that. And that's how we got to $400 billion from $10 billion authorization. And as I mentioned, this has a component that the administration can do through executive action, as well as a congressional component. Also on our list of short-term proposals is bringing back the Build America Bonds program. I was delighted to hear Governor Randall talk about the importance of Build America Bonds. In just 20 months, in the midst of the financial crisis, over $180 billion of Build America bonds went out the door. These are taxable federal government subsidized bonds. Federal government subsidizes the issuer. We propose a 28% subsidy rate, which is down from 35%. At 28%, the bonds would be revenue neutral because tax-exempt bonds are a major source of tax expenditures. The program has proved itself to be quite effective and moved very quickly. It's a fair way of supporting infrastructure because it's not doesn't involve subsidies to high-income tax payers. Also increases the realm of potential investors in U.S. infrastructure. Foreign investors benefit, pension funds benefit. Entities that are not taxed in the U.S. Benefit. We calculated when I worked at Treasury that state and local governments saved $20 billion by issuing Build America bonds as opposed to traditional tax-exempt bonds for their projects. And I have to say I think that was actually quite compelling research because we could compare the same state and local governments that issued Build America bonds and tax-exempt bonds on the same day. So it was very similar to research I had done on identical twins back at Princeton. Also part of our proposal is to expand the use of the Army Corps of Engineers to better utilize a Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, which currently has an $8.5 billion surplus. Also, they're not collecting all of the revenue that I think that they are potentially able to collect, which should be improved. And we also propose reforms to spending the money using competitive process like Tiger grants for some of the Army Corps of Engineer projects. Then lastly, we propose reforming the gas tax to stabilize the funding for the Highway Trust Fund. This idea is not new to us. We propose setting the gas tax so it varies inversely with the price of gasoline. That will help to stabilize the price for consumers. So when the gas price is low, the tax would be higher. When the gas price is high, the tax would be lower. a potential selling point, and we were careful to word the paper this way, is this is not necessarily an increase in the gas tax because we would have a minimum and a maximum. The minimum would be set below the current rate today, below the 18.4 cent tax today. So if the price of gasoline should rise very much in the future, it's potentially the case that the gas tax could be even lower. So it's not accurate to call this a proposal to raise the gas tax. It's reforming the gas tax to raise more revenue in the longer run and stabilize prices for consumers. In the longer run, as part of our philosophy of utilizing user fees, the gas tax is a user fee. It's becoming a less accurate user fee as we have more battery-powered vehicles and as mileage standards vary across cars. And the future holds tremendous potential for different methods of collecting user fees, more efficient methods of collecting user fees. You know, if you think about how Uber charges you, there's tremendous potential to innovate in collecting fees that are more closely aligned with businesses and households' use of infrastructure. What we propose is that the government has a role in supporting research and development to develop new technology to collect user fees and also to standardize user fees. It should be possible to drive from Maine down to Florida using EasyPass or some similar device. You shouldn't have to change devices as you cross state boundaries. So as part of our proposal to make it easier for states to collect user fees by investing in technology, which makes the user fees applicable to a much broader set of infrastructure. We would also provide incentives for state and local governments to adopt the new technology and to adopt standardized technology. We also propose incentives to encourage pooled procurement so that our infrastructure dollars will go towards more infrastructure investment. And the cost of infrastructure has been growing more quickly than the cost of prices overall. So there's some scope for improving the efficiency of infrastructure investment. We propose a national platform for procurement to take advantage of scale economies. Then lastly, you'll notice our proposal omits National Infrastructure Bank, not because we're opposed to a National Infrastructure Bank. In fact, I testified before the Banking Committee in favor of an infrastructure bank. But our idea is to have a commission which would be composed of state and local government officials, private sector players, to propose a national infrastructure strategy. And a very important role for the federal government is to help bridge across jurisdictional boundaries, across modal boundaries, and the commission would clearly articulate a national strategy for improving our infrastructure, and so that this would not be a commission whose report just ends up on the shelf and doesn't have any impact. We would propose that this commission help to guide federal subsidies to invest in projects that are high priority projects as recommended by the commission. So one can imagine, for example, Build America bonds with a more generous subsidy for projects that are consistent with the proposals of the National Infrastructure Commission. And in our view, if you combine an expansion of TIFIA and national infrastructure strategy and targeted subsidies to follow out that strategy, that could achieve much of what an infrastructure bank could achieve. So why don't I stop at that point, and I'll turn it back to Melissa.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to start the panel with an opening question to Congressman Delaney. So Congressman, would you comment on sort of the overarching ideas in this paper, in particular in light of the vision you have for what our nation needs to do to increase infrastructure investment?
Thank you for having me here today for this terrific panel. And my views on these proposals are that I give them very high marks. I think it's a very well formulated set of recommendations, so I want to compliment Aaron and Alan and Roger for the work. It's no surprise that they produce such a high quality work product, but I think they're all really smart ideas. In part, but I come to the I'm a bit biased on the topic because I come to this discussion with a view that increasing our investment in infrastructure should be our top domestic economic priority as a nation. Because I think in many ways it gets to all the things we should be concerned about as policymakers. Firstly, and most importantly, it really does improve the lives of our citizens. The fact that so many of my constituents, for example, endure 4 to 5 hours of commuting time a day on the underinvested Maryland road system means they're not, first of all, they're giving away a huge percentage of their life, because if you think they work 8 or 10 hours a day, sleep 6 or 8 hours a night, they don't have that much time left, and they're giving 70 or 80% of it to commuting. That means they're not spending time with their families, they're not reading to their children at night, they're not getting involved in their communities. So this is really an issue about our society and our communities and families. If we care about those things, we should be investing in infrastructure. It also makes us more competitive as a nation. One of the issues we all care about is the global competitiveness of the United States, particularly in a world that's rapidly changing because of technological innovation and global interconnection. And we cannot compete in this world unless we have a world-class portfolio of infrastructure assets, which we don't. And the data is pretty clear that we don't. So it gets to our competitiveness. But it also, it seems to me, is a really smart jobs program for this country. And if you think about how we're creating jobs right now, we're creating high-skilled, high-paid jobs at a fairly decent rate. And we're creating low-skilled jobs, but we're not creating these middle-skill, middle-class jobs at the rate we should. And infrastructure is a terrific jobs program for actually creating those type of jobs. And it's done in a way, as Alan said, that's a really good investment. I think infrastructure is the second best investment the government makes in terms of the multiplier effect it has on the economy after our investment in basic research. So if you care about jobs, these middle-class jobs that we all like to talk about, you should be focused on infrastructure. If you care about U.S. competitiveness and how we compete in this global and technology-enabled world, you should care about infrastructure. And most importantly, if we care about the quality of the lives of our constituents, this is what we should be doing. So I think all these recommendations are the right answer, but I do think there's more we need to do, which is one of the things that I've worked on, which is trying to figure out a way with the constraints we have fiscally to really find a meaningful amount of additional revenues for infrastructure. One thing I would have loved to have seen added to the list, not an infrastructure bank we can talk about, and other infrastructure funding we can talk about, but also changing the way the government thinks about our investment in infrastructure. We really should be dynamically scoring this, and I know that's not popular with people in my party, but we're never going to increase our investment in infrastructure unless we actually model its impact correctly. So that would be another item that I think would be useful.
So can I put you on the spot a minute?
Sure.
Because they didn't call for repatriation of
They did not.
funds. Do you think they should have?
Yes. Look at I think I suspect you didn't go there because that's a big change in our tax policy. As I said earlier, I think increasing infrastructure investment should be our number one priority. And if you look at the overall fiscal condition of the country, you do need to find some additional revenues to make that investment. And it seems to me the only place where we can find meaningful new revenues is through a change to our international tax system. Because right now we have an international tax system that creates all the wrong incentives. Companies theoretically owe a lot of tax associated with their overseas earnings. Very few of them are paying it, right? And because we allow them to defer the tax. So a reform to the international tax system like I've proposed that ends deferral, lowers the tax rate, would be good for companies, right? It would be good for the country because more revenues or more cash would flow back to the United States. And it's a revenue opportunity. And unlike a lot of the debates we have around tax policy in this country where there's this theoretical argument as to whether cutting taxes actually increases revenues, with respect to international tax reform, we know that if we end deferral and we give corporations a meaningful reduction in their tax rates, you will actually generate revenues. And it's not a theory, it's a fact. And so, in my opinion, we should do that, and we should dedicate all of the revenues that are generated towards infrastructure, because again, I think it should be our top domestic economic priority, and I also think it's the area of public policy where there's the most bipartisan support for additional spending. So I'm a huge believer in reform to the international tax system to encourage repatriation and to generate more revenues while also allowing our global companies to be more competitive.
Great, thank you. I'm going to let the authors talk about that in a moment. But first I want to bring Tyler, I want to bring you in on this discussion. So You had experience with TIFIA loans, and the authors have chosen to really promote TIFIA as a main way of increasing the financing available. What's your view on their proposals overall, but in particular on the feasibility of their TIFIA expansion?
So first, I'm a management consultant, so unlike the Congressman, I have no bias about any subject. Purely objective, except when it comes to the Washington Caps implosion, which has got me a little rattled.
Not over yet.
Look, at the end of the day, so we actually use a term in McKinesey called no regrets moves, and I think they've actually done their list is a lot of what you call no regrets things. And I think in an environment where we're in, where it's really tough to get anything done, I think it's always good to focus on things that are no regrets. So I think the TIFIA program has been at the center of a lot of the innovation around performance. So I know there's a lot of discussion around quantity of funding, but I think one of the things we focus on is the efficiency and effectiveness of the funding. So when you look at kind of the dollars pumped through the TIFIA program into the projects in the U.S., it's really high return projects. Projects in constrained areas, projects that utilize technology, projects that leverage additional resources. Those are the ones that actually really drive a lot of the efficiency gains in the U.S. transport system. So for that reason alone, I think it's a great idea. Obviously, the core challenge with the proposal is that the pipeline today is not full enough. And there are questions, obviously, we can always talk about how we pump more through that pipeline. But at the end of the day, the bigger the pipeline, the better. And then we can kind of work on the other side of the policy equation of making sure it gets more robust.
Are there steps we could take to increase the pipeline in the short run?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things we talked a lot about is whether you could tie these federal programs to incentives. We know that state and local governments have to drive a lot of the demand on the front end of these projects to get them into the pipeline. And so you've got federal levers, obviously you've got regulatory levers, you've got the credit programs themselves as policy levers, and you've got grant programs. I mean, and tax policy. Can you use those levers to basically drive state and local governments to utilize this program even more than they do today? And so right now we've got a disproportionate number of the projects in a very small number of states. So Virginia, Texas, increasingly some in the Northeast are finally looking at the program, but you've got too many projects in a relatively small number of states. So you look at Illinois, Ohio, who've done very little with the program. California, which started to do a lot, has done very little overall. You've just got a massive amount of the U.S. GDP not touching this program yet. So I would really try to tie federal policy to create incentives to basically use this program more robustly.
Great, thanks. So Aaron, I'm going to step back for a minute, and I just want to ask you, in sort of big picture, you and your co-authors have chosen to focus on transportation infrastructure in particular. But of course, our nation's infrastructure includes airways, railroads, schools, broadband, telecommunications more generally. Is there not something to be gained by making this more holistic and having a fuller strategy that takes on all aspects of infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a great question, Melissa, because at some point, everything can be infrastructure. It can be a wonderful catch-all phrase. And I think you have to come at it from a position that currently our structure is way too modally siloed. We have a program for commuter rail, a program for inner-city rail, a program for intra-city rail. It's too siloed. But on the other hand, there are kind of logical stepping moments. Transportation, water, electricity. Public schools, in my mind, is a little bit of a bridge too far. That's kind of inherently structured very differently in the federal government. And so what we've tried to do is focus more on the transportation side, one. Two is we've tried to break down some of those existing silos. So we've proposed expanding the TIFIA program, for example, to aviation and to water programs. In point of fact, the argument against has always been that TIFIA is funded out of the Highway Trust Fund. Well, guess what? For the last many years, the Highway Trust Fund's been funded out of general revenue. So there's a bit of a shell game going on here. So I think that's kind of point one. And point two is we're trying to create incentives to break down some of these silos that have been created at the federal level and mirrored at the state and local level. There's a reason why when you cross a bridge, there's one bridge for cars, one bridge for subways, one bridge for freight rail, right? I mean, at a certain point, there's a more efficient way to do things. And what we tried to do was balance the proposal to expand efficiency by bringing types of infrastructure together without trying to boil the ocean and address all of the societal problems through one magic bullet.
So I'm going to pick up on one point you made, which is that the Highway Trust Fund, it's really funded, supposed to be, and historically by the gas tax, but it's been shifting to general revenues, or at least it's been relying on general revenues. But you all have chosen to take on the gas tax, sort of, which presumes that linkage should be maintained. Why do you have that presumption? What's the cost of funding it out of general revenues for the long term?
So I think out of the long term, it gets to this core efficiency argument, which is that the model really first proposed by President Eisenhower, agreed by President Reagan, President Clinton, is that users of the system ought to fund it. And it's somewhat different than other aspects of the federal government. It shouldn't necessarily compete in other pools of discretionary funding. And in that way, we think that should still be the case. And in the short run, we need to adapt our gas tax, which is the same as it was, has been said before, since 1993, and also at the same time create some level of confidence for consumers who've experienced wild swings in the price of gas. You know, before this recent decrease in the price of gas, anybody here know the last time the price of gas was below $2? Who would guess 2009? It was that recent. We've had wild swings between $4 and $2, which a lot of research shows distorts consumptionary effects. So I think we ought to consider that and have a more stable impact system for consumers.
Alan, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, one level, we included the reform to the gas tax because we didn't want to have any regrets. In that it is a user fee. It's politically obviously very difficult, although I was cheered to learn that at the state local level it's not nearly as difficult as it is at the federal level. And we thought that this would also address two problems, as Aaron mentioned, the variability in the price of gasoline at the pump for consumers, which does distort behavior in terms of the types of cars people buy. You know, there's evidence that when the price of gas is relatively low, people will go out and buy a larger car, not looking down the road and expecting the price to change in the future. So it could help solve multiple problems. And as I mentioned, our philosophy was, to the extent possible, infrastructure should be funded with a user fee. And if you think about repatriation, that's very different than a user fee. Now, that said, I congratulate Congressman Delaney for his leadership on this issue. And if this is the only way Congress can manage to achieve greater investment in infrastructure, I could see the case for it. I said our philosophy is more is better. We don't want to let the best be the enemy of the good. But I would hope Congress could do better in terms of aligning the way the revenue is raised with the expenditures in this case.
But we should think of that as a short-term solution anyway, right? We can't rely on that in the long term.
You mean repatriation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, clearly because it's a one-time
Right.
infusion of cash, right? And you want a steady flow of funding. But I think part of the way we looked at it was, you know, first of all, we want to get something done. And the nice thing about a repatriation infrastructure deal is we have 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans supporting it. And it's very hard to find that kind of bipartisan support. So there's a deal to do there. I also think repatriation, allocating some of the revenues towards Highway Trust Fund, because what we do is we propose that we fix the international tax system. It generates a lot of one-time revenues. Some of that money gets allocated towards creating new infrastructure financing vehicles, which I think are very much needed. But a bunch of it goes towards pre-funding the Highway Trust Fund shortfall for 6 years. And then as part of that, overlaying a new user fee concept, which should involve adjustments to the gas tax, but it also should involve vehicles, miles driven, et cetera. Because if you envision the future that we all want, which is that cars are either materially more efficient around gasoline usage or they're electric or natural gas powered, I mean, that's, regardless of your views on larger environmental issues, that's where everyone wants to go, right? Everyone wants their car to be more efficient. Everyone wants those things to happen. If you envision that that future actually occurs, then you can't rely on the gas tax permanently to fund it. So you have to come to grips. And so I think it was my view that the best way to adjust the gas tax is to have it not kick in for a while, right? Because then elected officials can raise the gas tax but act like they didn't. So you take a large allocation of some of this revenues that's generated from repatriation, you allocate it towards the Highway Trust Fund, you give yourself some runway then to roll in some gas tax adjustments. And I love your proposal, how you fatten the gas taxes, gas prices go down, and thin it out when gas prices go up. You deliver a nice, consistent kind of gas price experience to the consumer. I think that's a great idea. But you also have to start thinking about other ways of generating user fees, because to my mind, if you look at where the private sector is going, we're going to see extraordinarily gasoline efficient, including lots of vehicles that don't use gasoline at all, vehicles, and those people ought to be contributing towards this system.
Yeah, and I think we try to drive home in the paper, it's not just user fees, but beneficiary fees. Land value, space around, other ways of creating mechanisms by which those who benefit can pay in. And trying to expand the concept beyond just user fee, we think will help create more revenue as well as create more of a political constituency to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish.
So, I think this, Tyler, you've also written for the Hamilton Project on the merits of user fees and congestion fees in particular. And reading this paper, the case for user fees seems like a no-brainer. So I have to admit, I was quite struck, maybe this was naive of me, by the announcement recently in Maryland that the governors decided to reduce tolls, which seemed exactly opposite what our state needs for infrastructure investment. Congressman Delaney, were you surprised by this? Where do you come down on this?
Well, listen, I obviously think it's short-sighted. I think he will certainly make some people who want to go to the beach this summer very happy, right? Because the tolls on the Bay Bridge are going to go down. But if you think about what Maryland really needs, Maryland needs to diversify its economy, right? We're the third most dependent state in the country on federal spending, and that's not a particularly good place to be. Even people who are advocating more federal spending think federal spending as a percentage of the economy will be less in the next 10 years as compared to what it was in the last 10 years. So we're vulnerable around our over-reliance upon federal spending, and which is one of the reasons why our unemployment has gone in the opposite direction of the country. It's been going up while the country's been going down. So we really haven't had a good economic strategy in Maryland. We suffer from some of the worst traffic anywhere in the country. We've got 3 major transportation projects that people want to do. Improving Route 270, which is the main kind of corridor in the life sciences, biotech community in Washington. That's where people have these 5-hour commutes, who I represent, because I represent that whole corridor. The Purple Line, which is a mass transit project around D.C., and then the Red Line, which is a mass transit project in Baltimore, which I think now people are in particular focusing on how important it is to make that investment. And we don't have the money. And I look at $54 million of tolls as at least $1.5 billion of investment capability when you look at Maryland's cost of funds, right? So I think that this is a very, very short-sighted decision as it relates to the things that I care about around infrastructure, which is improving the quality of people's lives, making regions more competitive, and actually doing things that actually create some demand in the labor market, particularly around middle-skilled jobs. So, listen, I think it'll be popular with some people, but I think it's a short-sighted economic decision.
So Tyler, picking up on that, there was a lot of Europe love on the first panel, right? So let's go there for a second. What about these, congestion pricing rings in Europe? Should our cities be doing something like that?
Yeah, so, I think clearly pricing works. It's actually being done now quite significantly in the U.S. and D.C. area. We've got 2 live projects on 495 and 95. Every major metropolitan area is currently planning to build what's called a hot lane network of some kind. So congestion pricing's here, it's happening. There are 20 plus projects live today. I think kind of the traditional cordon, either Stockholm or London style pricing, pretty difficult. I think San Francisco and New York, which we tried extensively to work with New York on their proposal when I was in government. Those are probably the only 2 that are conducive to a pure cordon or area-wide pricing. But the bottom line, I think, with pricing is speed of execution. So right now, a lot of the projects are basically new capacity projects. They're under the current U.S. delivery model, we're looking at 5 to 15 to 20 years out, which is really not exciting for people in government to deliver at that pace, not exciting for the people who and I'm a Montgomery County native as well. So basically, this is not a good answer for the public. I think what increasingly people should be looking at is what Miami did, what Minneapolis did, which is basically kind of light capital projects to either look at existing lanes to restripe them, looking at shoulder lanes. There's a lot of capacity looking at basically movable barriers. There's a lot of capacity in the network today that could be created very quickly. We're talking about 6 to 12 months. Technology is literally off the shelf, and consumers love it. So one thing that's always true about these pricing projects is the polling in advance is we don't know what this is. The polling after is we love it, don't ever take this away from it. So I think the more public officials can focus on near-term solutions, that will actually build a momentum for a longer-term transition.
Great. Okay, so let's get back to Build America bonds, because we haven't talked about those yet in the roundtable. So, Alan, why does everyone love them so much? Why are they sort of preferable to more traditional municipal bonds?
I think they're a better mousetrap. So if you think about the way tax-exempt bonds work, you're relying on buyers in high-income brackets to be willing to accept lower interest rate. the marginal buyer who determines the interest rate turns out not to be in the top bracket. So the average rate comes down by about 25%, where you would expect it to come down by 35 to 39.6%. So they're a very inefficient way of transferring money to state and local governments because there's some leakage which goes to the high-income buyers. So that's not only inefficient, but it's also unfair. Build America bonds are taxable bonds. They appeal to a wider audience, not just people who would benefit from having the tax-exempt status. They appeal to nonprofits. They appeal to foreign investors. They appeal to middle-income people. So it helps to democratize municipal finance. They're not the only way of doing things. There are also tax credit bonds. There's a whole family of different types of proposals. Build America bonds appeal to economists because they're transparent. You can see what the subsidies are. That makes them more difficult politically. You know, the subsidies are buried when California issues a municipal bond, which it issues a lot of them. They're being cross-subsidized by residents in states that are not issuing Build America tax-exempt bonds. But that's concealed, and it's much more transparent with the Build America bonds. So I wouldn't say we're religious in terms of this is the only kind of bonding solution, and there have been some alternatives. Tax credit bonds and the administration's proposal on QPIPs, which I think has a lot to be said for it. But if you're going to start with the first best solution, I think Build America bonds are a proven entity that have worked in this area.
I was going to ask you about the first best solution because when you were describing, you sort of were preemptively explaining why you didn't propose an infrastructure bank and explaining that the combination of TIFIA and a national strategy and Build America bonds gets you a lot of the way there. Should we think of an infrastructure bank as first best and what you've proposed as second best?
Really good question. It depends upon how the infrastructure bank is structured. And what was striking to me when I testified on the infrastructure bank, and I think Aaron wrote my testimony, was it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And and I also presume it'll be very small when it gets started. Now, maybe that's not wrong. You probably want to start on a small scale, but if it's small and it's an independent agency, you worry that it gets lost. And we see lots of examples of that in Washington, where there's nobody supporting it in the long run for its funding. And one worries about the judgments of the people who are selecting the projects in the infrastructure bank. So we thought, here's an alternative. Maybe this could help break the logjam. Although, as I mentioned, I think an infrastructure bank has a lot to be said for it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there is a little bit of a false choice about what's the best option. I mean, I think Build America bonds are terrific, but according to the civil engineers, because they do that report card every couple of years, they think we have a $3 to $4 trillion infrastructure hole. Now, they're a little biased, right? They want that number to be very big. They are the civil engineers. But that's a really big number. And you wouldn't have that kind of hole that we have unless there were a lot of factors that contributed to our underinvestment in infrastructure. So therefore, the ultimate solution really is multiple solutions that are project specific. So I think municipal bonds work in a lot of cases, Build America bonds work. Obviously, the way the Highway Trust Fund funds projects has proven to be very successful. And I think an infrastructure fund or an infrastructure bank could be very successful as well. But I agree with Alan. I think for it to be successful, it should be large. So it has lots of financial flexibility. It should have a long-term orientation. In other words, it shouldn't be subject to annual funding. It should have substantial funding upfront. It should have very much independent governance so that it's as separate from the federal government as possible and really more controlled by states and local governments with an independent board, because then it has much more of a chance of kind of being an on-the-level institution as opposed to something that's used for political favors. And because I think if it was structured that way with independence, a long-term orientation, and lots of capital, then what it could do is actually look at the market and say, where are the holes in the market? And I will develop products to meet those needs. So I would expect it to, if it was run right, it would go market to people who want to build infrastructure and say, what do you need? And then it would come up with products. And sometimes those products are very different than what exists in the market right now, because And this is where you get back to this shovel-ready concept, because I think a lot of smart infrastructure planning is not what's basically in a position to be done tomorrow, but it's based on what we really think we should be doing in the long term. So, and that's very stimulative to the economy in the short term, even if it doesn't get built for a long period of time, because people know what's happening and they start making investments, et cetera. So I think, for example, an infrastructure bank, if it could write a 10-year forward commitment to finance a project in 10 years or 15 years, to allow the people who want to do it, the local government and whoever their partners may be, to actually get it done, bring the communities together, knowing they have the financing. For example, I think that's a really attractive thing to have.
This conversation raises the issue of project selection. Is there anything in this proposal that would move us toward a system where taxpayers across the country could be more confident that high return projects are going to be the ones chosen? I mean, it seems there's certainly a skepticism of giving the federal government more infrastructure dollars because they're worried about wasteful spending.
So I'd say a couple things. First off, in the short term, I think the structure of TIFIA will give you a little more confidence in that. We've built up some fantastic transportation networks, and we've underinvested in linking them together. And we've done that precisely because we've created all these schizophrenic silos of airport authorities and highways and transit authorities that haven't linked them together.
Give us a concrete example. What do you want to link?
So, for example, linking airports to inner cities by rail, linking Greyhound bus to train stations. There was a federal law in place that prohibited Greyhound from being where a train was. So what did Greyhound do? It built a bus station on the other side of the tracks. It was always the wrong side of the tracks. It created a lot of crime. We finally removed that legal prohibition by the federal government, but when you think about it, there's a lot of different infrastructure that ought to get mixed in together. TIFIA, by expanding it for aviation, for ports and rail, there's another great one about freight rail and port, will promote that type of intermodal investment. That's in the short term. In the long term, we're going to create a national strategy. Kind of as the first panel alluded to, there needs to be one of the federal government areas the federal government needs to work is creating a vision. And in that space, we're then going to incentivize states and localities through more generous subsidies to build projects consistent with that vision, while preserving their autonomy. If they want to pay more and go their own way, they have that level of autonomy. So that's how we propose bridging that gap.
So I can't, when you mention the national strategy, there's one thing I keep thinking of, and probably because at the Hamilton Project, we recently had an event about the future of work in the age of the machine. And so we kept hearing from the MIT artificial intelligence guys about driverless cars and all these great things. So when I hear about the purple line that Congressman alluded to, which would take me from my neighborhood to University of Maryland, where I work half the week, so I should love it, I think by the time that thing's done, I'm going to have a driverless car picking me up. And, technology
That's not going to help you if you're stuck on the Beltway with all the other driverless cars.
Okay, fine, maybe it'll fly. I don't know, right? But technology is developing so rapidly, much more rapidly than it did in the 1950s. Doesn't that make you cautious about the federal government picking our technological strategy in transportation for the next 20 years?
So I'd actually flip that. If we don't, how are we going to ever coalesce around a national network? We keep, in terms of alternative fuels, sliding between electric. I remember that giant hydrogen network we were going to have. We were going to have a CNG network that public transit authorities invested a lot in. There was going to be an ethanol network. By failing to select one, we actually paradoxically select none. And when you're dealing with large network effects like this, it can be a significant problem and withhold and retard technology rather than making an affirmative choice that this is where we're going to go.
Yeah, no, I think you're actually hitting on a really important question, which is design flexibility. And I think the problem with fixed networks of any kind, as he's saying, is that you do have to kind of make some bets, right? But I do think embedded in federal policy should be an acknowledgement that technology is happening much faster than the government can absorb. And, I have a 9-year-old daughter, soon to be 10, and, I'm betting that I'm never going to need to teach her how to drive, thankfully, given her personality. But I think at the end of the day, the policies and programs the federal government adopts have got to effectively be receptive to state and local governments really experimenting on this, because I don't know what the network's going to look like in 10 years. I don't think anybody does. I'll never forget forget when we did the last National Commission, Matt Rose, who's the head of BNSF Railroad, was asked about a 50-year vision for transportation. We were on a conference call, and he said, I don't know what my business is going to look like in 5 years. And he runs one of the biggest fixed networks in the country, right? So it is a big challenge. I do think we need to make some bets. But I think the other problem is the upfront bets are not being followed by policies to pump them through the pipeline fast enough. So I think as a country, we can do a lot better on the front end. Project selection, I think we recognize cost benefit now as a term, which nobody used in transportation 10 years ago, believe it or not, at least at the policy level. Thanks to Emil Frankel, we now use it. And then, we obviously now understand new construction techniques, but the middle of that pipeline is really broken in the U.S., right? The planning process, the environmental process, the procurement of engineering services, that's really broken, and it's taking significantly too long, and I think the federal government could really accelerate that.
So is the perception correct that there is more private investment in public infrastructure projects abroad? And if that's true, what can we do about that in the U.S.? What do you think is the best way to get private or foreign money into this game? Congressman, do you want to?
Well, it's here. I mean, look, every state should have public-private partnership frameworks for being able to do these things, which not every state in the country does. So clearly we should have more frameworks to allow that to happen. I think Build America bonds do that because, as Alan very accurately described, the municipal bond market is really not of interest to those people because the benefit isn't really conveyed to them. And again, my concept on repatriation, I really think of as the ultimate macro public-private partnership, right? Because you're basically increasing investment in infrastructure based on doing something to encourage the flow of private capital back to the United States. So I think all of those things are important, but I do think we have to remember that a lot of infrastructure doesn't pencil out the way a lot of investors would like. Right, the majority of infrastructure does not. Right, it's for the public good. Right, it's for the good of the citizens. It's for the good of the competitiveness of the region, and it's really important to do that. And it ties into the discussion we had a second ago about infrastructure being obsolete and should, our inability to predict the future with absolute certainty should not discourage us from making decisions that we believe on the merits, looking at all the factors, are smart today. And I think if you go around this country, if you see a region that has had good, consistent economic growth, you rarely find examples of where their infrastructure has gone entirely obsolete, right? Because economic growth continued to put demand on the current infrastructure to the point where even if it was a suboptimal based on the current world we're in today, it's still being used. Where you see infrastructure going obsolete is when you have the opposite, where you have economies declining, which gets back to the point about what innovation is doing to the jobs market. It's very concerning about what's going to happen to the labor market in this country based on this pace of innovation, which is why thinking about competitiveness, making sure we're making investments in regions that really are well positioned to thrive is important. Private capital should be part of that, but private capital won't solve all the infrastructure needs that we have.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question, though, that overseas, I mean, you look at the national policies in the UK, Canada, Australia, Spain, Brazil, now most of Asia, it is clearly basically to utilize private capital for the largest, most complex projects with revenue streams either tied to the projects or tied to something else. And I think part of it is our legacy, right? We had the equivalent of what China is doing now happened in the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, we built out the biggest highway system by double the mileage of any other highway system in the world. So we got a lot of stuff, more airports than anyone in the world by far. So we build it all out using a traditional model that we've got, and so we're still a little bit tied to that. These other countries, by necessity, I mean, Spain is a great example. In the early 70s, they said no more with the traditional model, and you now have some of the best infrastructure companies in the world. They're big Spanish companies roaming the globe doing deals.
What's at the heart of that? Are they more open to user fee collection?
It's a mix. There's some of that. I think, honestly, at the end of the day, it was the government expertise to deliver the projects and the pool of capital they thought they could leverage. They also don't have a municipal bond market anywhere else in the world.
So I guess I'd add 2 points. The first is, and Congressman Delaney's legislation does a great job of this, which is promoting project finance. Because project finance is inherently the way to bring private capital in, as opposed to balance sheet finance, where the government just funds it like it funds any other part of its general obligation. In order to get private sector, and you need to segregate that out and have a private finance. The second point I'd make is there's a little more private sector in what we think of as not private sector, right? So the traditional municipal debt market is private capital coming in through the states and local government. And the workers that Congressman Delaney refers to, and Alan and I did a paper at Treasury, 80% of the jobs in infrastructure are created in three sectors: construction, manufacturing, and wholesale and retail trade. Of those 80% of the jobs, 90% of them are middle class. And I'll define middle class as the middle two quartiles, 25th to 75th percentile wages. Those are real middle class jobs that are created that are mostly private sector jobs. I mean, the people who are actually filling in the pothole, as Governor Rendell said, are bid contract employees. For the most part, they're not actually state government workers.
Is this actually net job creation, or are those guys not getting pulled from other jobs?
Net job creation.
Well, with the unemployment rate at 8.5% in construction, it's net. I would say it's net job creation.
He's the only labor economist in the past.
So we accept that. Okay, I'm going to ask some questions. So here, okay, for Congressman Delaney, how important is it for state and local politicians to understand the long-term socioeconomic effects of past infrastructure projects in order to make decisions on future investments? I think the person's also interested in knowing whether there's enough studies or data to know about the impacts of projects that have been undertaken.
Well, look at it. It's obviously important to look at decisions you've made in the past to see if they were well-reasoned decisions and if they paid off the way they did. So I'm not exactly sure exactly what they're getting at. One thing that we don't do enough of, and I've seen it in my own state of Maryland, there isn't really enough transparency around how the decisions are made. Again, we have three big transportation-related projects that are being considered in Maryland. The Purple Line, which is this light rail around D.C., the Red Line, which is light rail in Baltimore, and then the whole 270 corridor, where there's a whole portfolio of things to do. And I've been pushing for a while to really have the state disclose their analysis around these projects. In other words, one of them cost $1 billion, the other two cost about $2.5 billion. And what do the projections show in terms of economic development across the long term, and what's really the best return on investment from an economic development perspective, which gets into the socioeconomic analysis of it. And we don't do as good of a job on that stuff as we should, because let's face it, a lot of these projects are made based on political decisions, right? So a Democrat is more likely to support certain projects because their voters are there, and a Republican is more likely to support other projects. We have to get away from some of that and really do have a higher level of transparency around what's really expected from these projects, and then hold people accountable to these decisions. Because if you do make decisions, because all infrastructure works to some extent, right? You rarely find examples where better roads or better bridges or any of this stuff isn't on the margin helpful to people, but is it really the best investment of the taxpayers' treasure? That's really, I think, what we don't do enough analysis around. I know in my state, and I suspect around the country as well.
So I'm gonna add for this person, in addition to the economic impacts, what about the distributional impacts of all this? I mean, a lot of you have talked about user fees and raising the gas tax. Don't we worry that that's regressive?
Which is why private capital isn't the solution to everything, right? Which, some of this stuff, it's just our responsibility of elected officials to support the communities and make sure the people in those communities, and particularly the kids, have a shot. And if they're cut off from the world because they either don't have broadband access, which is part of the communities I represent in Western Maryland. I mean, imagine growing up as a kid in this country and not having, high-speed access and really thinking you're going to have a shot in the world. Or if you're in communities where the transportation systems are such where you have very long commutes and you have to take 4 or 5 buses to go a distance as the crow flies, which is 2 miles. Those are really important considerations if we want to make sure that people in those communities actually have a shot, together with the educational system and all the other components. But it really is part of that discussion.
I would say the distributional consequences are pretty hard to fully study, in that the very poor are not driving around in cars for the most part. They're trying to find the Greyhound bus if they're going to travel. So I think you're probably talking more about closer to the middle, bearing more of the incidence of the user fees, who are benefiting from the additional infrastructure, saving time on their commutes, which improves the quality of their lives. And I think you have to look at the cost kind of net of the benefits to them. And by and large, I think that's probably quite positive. And then there's the issue of who's the work that's being created to produce the infrastructure, which, as Aaron mentioned, this very careful Treasury study found that was by and large middle-class jobs.
I mean, the way I think we used to talk about it was compared to what, right? I mean, today's model, I think, is you've got lots of regressive elements built in today's approach. Obviously, the taxes, either sales or gas, have regressive elements. Congestion itself can be regressive. The unreliability of the system can be regressive. If you can price to improve transit performance, that would obviously be non-regressive policy. So I think it's obviously compared to what we're doing today. And if you still decide you've got problems with distribution, you can always tailor policies around that. But I don't think the solution to concern about that should be to have the network melting down like we have every day.
Good. Okay, we've got a fiscal federalism question. Will devolution of transportation to the states happen by default if states raise gas taxes but the feds do not? Who wants to take it?
The feds have made it easier for the states to raise gas taxes by freezing the federal gas tax, but it doesn't solve our infrastructure problem because, as Aaron said, much of it is multi-jurisdictional, multimodal, and that really needs federal incentives to solve. So I think that's a very imperfect solution, which I hope is not where we end up.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically states are clearly now doing a lot more. I think the other big trend in the last 10 years is the enactment of state laws to allow them much more procurement flexibility. So, 15 years ago, states did not have a lot of tools in the toolkit, so to speak, to do innovative things. That has changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. So I think, states are going to continue to do what they're doing. At the end of the day, the most direct political accountability is as we heard last panel, is at the gubernatorial and mayoral level. So they've got to do something. They can't sit and watch the situation melt down. But obviously, federal policy can be real supportive.
Okay, two more. What's the role of value capture in infrastructure funding?
Not nearly enough as it needs to be. There's, as part of this new technology, and the Silver Line had an example here where they created a baseline of property tax and then said, if this new infrastructure investment exceeds value over this baseline, your rate will rise. So it's kind of a win-win. We need to think of more areas. I was struck by the vision that Congressman Delaney pointed out. The city of Charlotte, where the transportation secretary was mayor, did a fantastic job of rezoning its investment around its future rail line. And that additional value capture can go back into paying that area. Part of the problem is the federal government gets nervous when there are new and innovative ways to capture value, and then gives them punitive discounts when they look at how to put in federal matching dollars, which retards the very innovative investment necessary to spur more infrastructure growth.
Okay, I've got one for the professor. How does TIFIA work? How come $10 billion leads to $400 billion in financing? Bringing rolling chalkboard? Yeah.
TIFIA gets highly leveraged, is the short answer. And the TIFIA is scored on the basis of the expected losses. So if the expected losses are very small, our presumption is, say, 5%, that means that $1 could support $20 of, say, loan guarantees. Then TIFIA also requires additional financing outside of the federal government. Could be private, could be state and local, which is at a requirement of 1-to-1, so that doubles it. So it's more like 40-to-1, or maximum of 40-to-1 for each dollar spent on, each federal tax dollar spent on TIFIA.
Good. Aaron, we didn't get to talk about this, and I know you were so excited this was in the paper. Can you tell us about pooled procurement?
Sure. In the lightning round, I'll tell you a simple story, which is those of you who've ridden on BART and the DC Metro, it's the same. They were built about the same time, same technology. They have the same rail cars. They could coordinate and buy them together, and as most things happen, when you pool your procurement, you have economies of scale and you can procure things cheaper. In addition, because their systems have correlated sources of revenue, i.e. the federal government, when they tend to get the same one-time shot of money in a new transportation bill or in a stimulus, all of a sudden they go to their back order and they make the same order at the same time, which is more expensive because the Kawasaki, which makes the rail cars, has one platform. So instead, if you could have these systems pool their procurement, and what's true for two large city transit lines is the same for thousands of bus agencies lots of ports, et cetera. If you could build a platform where they could work together, eliminate transaction costs, they could buy and produce, they could purchase things more cheaply and efficiently, stretching our transportation dollar further. And on the flip side, it would provide more certainty for the producers of this procurement, which would allow them more stability to grow their business.
Would anyone like a final remark? In that case, please join me in thanking our panelists.